welcome to I Love This Thing So Fricking Much, a podcast about passion. My name is Sophie Katz, and today I am joined by V. Arrow, host of the podcast This Week in Fandom History. Welcome to the show, V.
Hello, I'm so glad to be here.
Oh, I'm glad to have you here. So here's how this works. V will have 3 minutes to talk about something that she loves. This can be a person, place, thing, concept, activity, anything she wants. Our only requirement is that she loves it wholeheartedly and wants to tell us why. Are you ready, V?
Yes, I am.
Good. Got my timer here. Now, what do you love so freaking much?
I love fandom history, which is why I decided to start a podcast celebrating fandom history. And the reason that I love it is because I grew up, steeped in, honestly, fandoms that made me love history, American Girl mainly. And looking at the history of fandom, I realized that it was really just the history of people and the history of women and the history of people who really, really loved stuff. And those are all the things that I love in this world. And looking at how people loved what they loved is such a great way to learn about the time that they were living in and the way that they were being treated. And so if you look at how Victorian, mainly women, but Victorian fans mourned for Sherlock Holmes, you can learn so much about Victorian death culture, which as a goth, I think is really fun and creepy and interesting. And if you look at the 1980s, VCRs were invented and were this hugely political thing. And the way that women looked at VCRs and said, ooh, I can make tapes where I just cut out the shippy parts of Starsky and Hutch and make videos for my friends and mail them. And these were illegal videotapes because they were often cut with gay porn, which was illegal at the time because it was illegal to send queer material through the mail. But they were willing to do that because they loved Starsky and Hutch so much and they loved their friends and they wanted their friends to be happy. And then you look at the 2000s and the invention of the home internet for most people, AOL mailing discs to everybody. Everybody's first thing that they looked up on the internet was something that they loved. And you can tell that from the way that fandom created internet culture. There's actually a great book that recently came out about fandom culture and the internet called Everything I Needed I Learned from You, I think is what it's called, by Caitlin Tiffany. I know the author name is correct. And it's basically that fandom shaped the way that the internet works because the internet started out as this is where I go to get more of what I love. And I think that that's beautiful. I think that that's kind of true for every form of media that has risen in every era of history. And you can really see that when you look at how different eras of fandom used what was available to them to love their thing so freaking much, all the more. Like fan clubs in the 60s for Star Trek, a lot of them pretended to be Tupperware clubs because their husbands didn't understand that they just loved Spock so freaking much. And so they would go to church basements and bring a potluck and bring their Tupperware and then sit and talk about how much they loved Spock. And it's so of its time. And I think every part of fandom history is very much of its time. And so are we.
Go ahead and finish your thought.
That's what I find really interesting of it, is to look at it and say, what about how we love what we love right now is going to reflect on our time as a whole in the future?
That's awesome. Thank you for telling us about fandom history today.
Anytime.
I really love the way you put it, that the history of fandom is just simply the history of people who love things.
I think that that's really what it should all be about, ultimately.
Especially looking at a lot of the stereotypes around the internet and the way it's used today, thinking of the internet as something that began out of love, that the first internet searches were show me more of this thing I love. That's really casts the whole use of this tool in a whole new light for me.
And I think looking at the way that people embrace new media whenever we find a new way to connect to others, we tend to do it first as how can I see more of what I love? How can I find people who love what I love? And that's such a human impulse. And I think that's why I love fandom history specifically, is I think it's extremely human to want to connect with people who we have things in common with.
And like you said, we will seek out that connection with the means that are available to us. Like certainly today, someone who loves a particular couple on a TV show, they will reblog posts about them. They'll share YouTube links about them. And back in the day, mailing VHS tapes was that era's version of this.
Exactly. I mean, before the internet, people were going to jail or at least paying a heavy fine to make these connections. And I think honoring that and remembering that we come from this culture of subversity is also an aspect of fandom history that I really love. It's very recent that you can send quote unquote obscene materials through the mail, and obscene meant queer. And so people would write fan fiction, they would create art, they would create these VHS tapes, they would send it through the mail to their friends, to their fan clubs, to people who they had things in common with, knowing that they were doing something illegal, but it wasn't wrong. You know, it was celebrating love, it was celebrating queer people, it was celebrating a couple that they loved, it was celebrating a media that they loved, and it was celebrating their friends. And I think that that quiet rebellion is baked into fandom culture.
It feels encouraging to be grateful for the time period we're in now, that in most cases we don't have to say that we're going to Tupperware Club when we want to read a fan fiction.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, maybe on Thanksgiving dinner when you have to slip away for 5 minutes, you can say, oh, I'm going to go pack up the leftovers. And that's kind of like going to Tupperware Club.
The excuses of the time also tells you something about the time period, that going to a Tupperware Club was a viable excuse.
And same going back all the way, like I said, to Victorian times, and people went all out with the Victorian mourning culture. But about this fictional character of Sherlock Holmes, they wore all black and they had the black armbands and the black veils and the incense and all of these things that were part of their culture. But it helped them find one another to mourn with. And I think that that's really beautiful. And that's obviously one of the first examples that we see of modern fandom.
Yeah, I found that example particularly interesting because while certainly some examples of historical fandom and fandom today are subversive and going against the norms, you can also learn about the norms of society in that, because I can only assume these were the normal ways to grieve for people. Just the unusual aspect was that it was a fictional character.
Like you said, learning about the norms of, the 60s, the normal way, quote unquote, for women to congregate was to do a Tupperware club or a knitting club where they were producing something for the home. That's why it worked as an excuse for, I'm going to go talk about Spock. That's what fandom history has really been, is how am I going to hide what I'm doing that is fanish within what is acceptable? It's really within the last 5 years that fandom has become mainstreamed enough that you can even publicly say, oh, I read and write fan fiction. It used to be if you read and wrote fan fiction, you could never have a professional writing career if people found out. I think it is a new era of fandom history to see it be mainstreamed and embraced as much as it has been, because so many best-selling authors now openly read and write fan fiction. And also so many showrunners and so many actors openly have read and written fan fiction. There's episodes of shows like Supernatural, which is the fan fiction show in terms of the number of fan fictions written about it, have episodes that are about people reading and writing fan fiction. That is such a new thing in the scheme of people loving stuff that it's been very interesting to see the difference in how fandom acts and also how people act about fandom.
It almost seems like we've entered an era where there's a certain degree of expectation that if you love a show, you will be the wholehearted biggest fan about it. How much hype there is on every social media and every convention about the next Marvel movie, the next Star Wars movie. There's this expectation that everyone should be the most excited possible about every new thing in a fandom. I'm not sure in this moment what that says about our historical moment, but probably in hindsight, it will say something.
I agree. And I think that that has been a negative thing for fandom as a whole, and also for art and for media as a whole, because I think the expectation that everything needs to hit number one and everything needs to have the most fan engagement and everything needs to be the next big thing. It creates this churn and turnover culture in media creation where everybody knows Netflix has a great new show. It's going to get canceled in 2 seasons because that's how they work. When the first season comes out, they're going to hype it up really big. Everybody's going to be really excited. It's going to be number one. There's going to be an explosion of fic for it. Then they're never going to hype that season 2 exists at all. And then they cancel the show. And so people who genuinely did love that show so freaking much get kind of screwed over, because that number of people is never going to be enough to make something super number one every single time consistently over time. But also, this turn and churn culture then is bad for fandom because you have to change what your outward biggest fandom is so often that even if your heart's not actually in it, you have to act like it is. And that's never been what fandom should be about. You keep loving your thing. There are people who are still wholeheartedly Kirk Spock shippers who started shipping in 1969. And that's great. That's their fandom. There are people genuinely who have a new favorite thing every year, and that's great too. But I don't think the expectation should be that that's everybody.
Absolutely. This is one of those times where I'm looking at something in two different angles and they both seem to be true. Like the one angle is it's unrealistic to expect that everything, every piece of media will be worthy of the biggest love from literally everyone who sees it, and that an individual person is going to love everything that's new all the time. Like that's unrealistic. And at the other side, it is the most natural thing in the world for any human to love something wholeheartedly.
I mean, the good thing about the constantly changing media landscape that we're in, and by constantly changing, I mean what is quote unquote on at any given time, the constant new shows and constant new podcasts and constant new audio dramas and constant new books. What's great is it gives you more of an opportunity to find that thing that really speaks to your heart. But the bad thing is, what I've noticed is a lot of people have started to get very wary of loving anything new because there is that expectation of, oh, Netflix is just going to cancel this in 2 seasons. So they don't want to get invested anymore. And that stinks because there are those fandoms that have been going for 100 years, like Sherlock Holmes, or 50 years, like Star Trek and Star Wars. There's so many things that I see people being so passionate about that are more recent that don't have the opportunity to really get those legs and become those long entrenched fandoms that really have been the tentpole of what we do and what we love on the internet. I think seeing things just get canceled and then immediately forgotten about by their network or by their creator or by their wider fandom of people who just like it but don't super love it is really disheartening to people.
So now I'm thinking, what do we do about that? Is there anything that you've learned from your perspective as a fandom historian of what to do about the fandom future?
I mean, I think the biggest thing is we need to remember that fandom is not the work. It is the fans and what fans are doing for and with and because of each other.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that is causing this fear and this stepping back from loving things wholeheartedly is this idea that if there's no more canon, the fandom will be over. And that historically has never really been the case. There are still very, very active fan communities for Starsky and Hutch. That show has not had new content since the 80s. There's currently right now a fan exchange running for the show Forever Night, which was canceled after 3 seasons in 1996. Fandoms, if that's where your heart is, and if you want to celebrate with your friends and create this community of people who love this thing, it becomes ancillary whether there's more canon. I mean, you can have a fandom that had one movie and never had any spinoffs. It should be about what can you create? What about it inspired you to continue creating? Your friend really loves stories about this tertiary character. I'm going to create more stories about this tertiary character for them for as long as they want to read them. Fandom isn't about the canon. It's about everything that isn't canon and what you can do with it and for whom you're doing it. It has to return to being about the creation and the friendships, and that will help.
V, thank you so much for telling us about something you love today.
Yeah, anytime. And if you want to hear more about fandom history and some specific examples, you can definitely head over on your podcast feed after this to This Week in Fandom History. It's a fun show and we talk a lot about all different fandoms. I've learned about so many ways that people have loved things. It's wonderful.
And thank you, our listeners, for tuning in today. And like V said, if you would like to learn more about fandom history, you can find the link to her podcast, This Week in Fandom History, in the episode description. And if you have something you love so freaking much you want to tell me all about it, consider this your invitation to join the show. I Love This Thing So Freaking Much is a production of Through the Window Media. This episode was directed and edited by Sophie A. Katz. You can find us at Through the Window on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or Tumblr. That is THROU the Window at all those social media sites. Be good to yourself, be kind to each other, and you'll hear from us again soon.